Young single mom started dating with him without knowing he already has someone else. The relentless Portland rain lashed against the large glass windows of the Beaverton Rehabilitation Clinic. Inside, the air smelled of sterile wipes and peppermint oil. Lauren adjusted the heavy canvas gait belt around her patient. "You are pulling too hard," Mr. Henderson complained, swatting at her hand. "I am just making sure you are secure, Mr. Henderson," Lauren said. She kept her voice soft and professional, but beneath her medical scrubs, her shoulders ached with a dull, throbbing pain. She glanced toward the waiting area. Through the glass partition, she could see her 6-year-old son, Leo. He sat on a plastic chair, staring down at a brightly colored children's book. He was tracing the letters with his small finger, his eyebrows pulled together in deep frustration. The letters always danced and twisted in his mind. Every day was a battle, for her patients, for her son, for herself. When her shift finally ended, Lauren felt completely hollowed out. She took Leo by the hand, and they dashed across the wet asphalt to the small coffee shop opposite the clinic. She desperately needed caffeine just to survive the drive home. The bell above the door chimed. The shop was warm, filled with the rich aroma of roasted espresso beans. Lauren stepped up to the counter. She reached into her oversized tote bag. Her fingers fumbled past medical tape, wet wipes, and scattered crayons. She pulled out her wallet, but her hands were trembling from sheer exhaustion. The leather wallet slipped from her grasp. It hit the floor, spilling silver coins and a stack of crumpled receipts across the wooden floorboards. "Oh no," Lauren whispered. She dropped to her knees, feeling a sudden, overwhelming urge to just sit on the floor and cry. Before she could gather the scattered coins, a large, warm hand reached down. "Let me help you with that." The voice was deep, steady, and incredibly calm. Lauren looked up. A man knelt beside her. He wore a tailored wool coat that was slightly damp from the rain. His movements were deliberate and gentle as he gathered her coins. "Thank you," Lauren breathed out, her voice barely a whisper. It has been a very long day." He handed the wallet back to her. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. Lauren looked into his face. He was handsome, in a quiet, understated way, but what caught her breath were his eyes. They were a striking shade of hazel, but they carried a profound, unmistakable sorrow. It was a look of quiet endurance. "I know the feeling," he said softly. He stood up and turned to the barista. "I will pay for her order, please. Whatever she needs." "You do not have to do that," Lauren protested, standing up quickly. "Please," he said, turning back to her with a small, melancholic smile. "My name is Thomas, and it looks like you could use a break." For the first time in 5 years, Lauren did not feel like a tired physical therapy technician. She did not feel like a struggling single mother. Looking into Thomas and his sad eyes, she just felt like a woman who was finally being seen. And in that brief, quiet moment, a dangerous spark of hope ignited in her exhausted heart. The gray Portland skies did not change, but suddenly, the rain felt different. It no longer felt like a heavy weight pressing down on Lauren's shoulders. Instead, it felt like a silver curtain, shielding her and Thomas from a world that had been far too loud for far too long. Their relationship moved with the quiet intensity of a rising tide. Within weeks, Thomas became a permanent fixture in their lives. He did not just date Lauren, he integrated himself into the difficult, fractured rhythm of her existence with a grace she had never seen before. One Saturday afternoon, they walked through Washington Park. The giant redwoods towered above them, their needles dripping with thick mist. The air was cold, but Thomas kept his hand firmly in Lauren's coat pocket, lacing his fingers with hers. "He is very quiet today," Thomas noted, nodding toward Leo. The boy was several yards ahead, kicking a pine cone and keeping his head down. He had a rough session at school. Lauren sighed, her breath hitching in the damp air. The teacher tried to make him read aloud. He's shut down. He thinks the letters are monsters that want to trick him. Thomas did not offer a pitying look. He did not say it would be okay. Instead, he knelt in the damp dirt next to Leo. "You know, Leo," Thomas said, "I have a secret. I hate reading long lists of instructions. They look like a bunch of tangled spiders to me." Leo stopped kicking the pine cone. He looked up, his eyes wide and curious. "Really?" "Really. That is why I became an architect. I like pictures. I like how lines tell stories without using words at all." That evening, the scene shifted to the warmth of Lauren's small apartment. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and rosemary. Lauren watched from the kitchen as Thomas sat with Leo on the hardwood floor. They were not looking at a textbook. They were looking at a large blue architectural blueprint Thomas had brought over. "Look at this curve here," Thomas whispered, pointing to a swirl. "This is the letter SID. In my world, this is not just a sound. This is a grand winding staircase in a library." Leo traced the line with his small finger. For the first time, he was not flinching at the sight of a symbol. "Everyone sees letters differently, Leo," Thomas said, his voice steady and patient. "Just like I look at an architectural drawing. Every line is its own story. You just have to find the story that makes sense to you." Lauren leaned against the counter, her heart aching in a way she had not felt in years. Leo's biological father had walked out because he could not handle the stress of a child who struggled. He had called Leo lazy. He had called Lauren's job a distraction. But Thomas was different. He was a builder. He was building a bridge for her son. Lauren felt like she was living in a beautiful, impossible dream. After years of fighting every battle alone, someone had finally stepped into the arena to fight alongside her. She felt a terrifying, beautiful sense of absolute trust beginning to form. Late that night, Lauren walked into the living room after finishing a load of laundry. The television was on low, casting a soft, flickering blue glow. On the sofa, Thomas was fast asleep. His jaw was relaxed in a way she rarely saw. Tucked firmly under his arm was Leo. The boy had fallen asleep with his head on Thomas's chest, clutching a book about dragons. The sight hit Lauren like a physical blow. She stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob of relief. She watched the synchronized rise and fall of their chests. In that quiet, domestic moment, the last of her defenses crumbled into dust. She loved him. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that she had finally found the man who would help her carry the weight of her world. She did not know that just 10 miles away, another woman was staring at the ceiling of a darkened room, waiting for her husband. The rhythmic drumming of the Portland rain hit the roof of Thomas's SUV, creating a heavy curtain of sound that separated them from the wet world outside. Inside, the cabin was warm, smelling of expensive leather and the faint trace of his cedar cologne. Lauren leaned her head against the passenger window, watching the blurred streetlights streak past the glass. They had been dating for 4 solid months. 4 months of quiet dinners and stolen moments of peace that Lauren had desperately needed. After years of fighting every battle alone, she finally felt like she was breathing again. "Dinner was amazing tonight," Lauren said softly, turning to look at him. The dashboard lights cast a soft blue glow over his sharp jawline. "That restaurant is a hidden gem." "I am glad you liked it," Thomas replied. His voice was smooth, but his hazel eyes remained locked on the dark road ahead. Lauren took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She hated asking for things, but this felt like the natural next step. "You know, Thomas, it has been 4 months now." Thomas gave a small nod, his hands resting easily on the steering wheel. "I was thinking," Lauren continued, keeping her tone light, "maybe Leo and I could come over to your place this weekend. Or, if you are still fixing it up, I could come help. I am actually pretty great with a paintbrush." The atmosphere in the car shifted instantly. It was as if all the warm oxygen had been suddenly sucked out, leaving a cold vacuum. Thomas did not answer right away. The silence stretched out, loud and uncomfortable over the sound of the rain. Lauren watched his hands. His long fingers tightened around the leather steering wheel, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. The veins in his forearms strained as if he were bracing for an impact. "Not yet, Lauren," Thomas said. His voice was suddenly dry, distant, and stripped of the warmth he usually saved for her. "The house is still a disaster zone. Dust everywhere, exposed wires. It is not safe for Leo, and I do not want you working in that mess." Lauren frowned. The excuse felt rehearsed. "I really do not mind," she pressed gently. She unbuckled her seatbelt to lean over the center console, placing her hand over his right arm. The muscle beneath his sweater was tense and hard as a rock. "I just want to see where you live, Thomas. I want to be part of your whole life. We cannot exist in coffee shops forever." Thomas hit the brakes much harder than necessary at a yellow light. The heavy SUV jerked to a stop, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. He pulled his arm away from her touch quickly, almost as if her hand had burned him. His chest rose and fell rapidly. "I said not yet," Thomas snapped. The harshness in his tone echoed in the small space. Lauren recoiled, staring at him in complete shock. She had never heard him raise his voice. Not even when Leo had spilled juice all over his blueprints last week, Thomas instantly realized what he had done. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, a look of absolute agony crossing his face. "I am sorry," he exhaled, his voice trembling. "The architecture firm is demanding a lot right now. The deadlines are killing me, and I am barely sleeping. I just want the house to be perfect for you and Leo. Please, Lauren, do not push this." He was begging her. His eyes were wide and desperate. But beneath that look, Lauren saw something else entirely. She saw sheer, unadulterated panic. He was terrified that his beautiful, fragile oasis was about to be shattered. Lauren pulled her hand back into her lap and folded her arms. The romantic warmth of the evening had vanished, replaced by a cold chill creeping down her spine. This was not the calm man who read stories to her son. This was a man fiercely guarding a heavily fortified wall. Her single mother intuition started screaming at her. There was a ghost sitting in the car with them. An invisible, impenetrable barrier had just dropped between their seats. Lauren looked out the window again into the dark, rainy night. "Okay, Thomas," she whispered. "I will not push it." The rest of the drive was silent, but she knew, deep in her gut, that something was terribly wrong. The fluorescent lights of the Whole Foods in Hillsborough hummed with a clinical, white energy that made Lauren's head ache. She had driven 40 minutes outside of central Portland, past the suburban sprawls and rain-slicked highways, just to find the specific organic oat cereal Leo loved. It was a mundane task, but her mind was still trapped in the cold, suffocating silence of Thomas's car from 2 nights ago. The supermarket was quiet for a Tuesday afternoon, smelling of fresh kale, expensive cheese, and the faint scent of rain. Lauren moved down the breakfast aisle, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the cardboard boxes. Then, at the far end of the wide aisle, she saw a flash of dark wool. Lauren froze, her hand hovering over a box of granola. She knew that coat. It was the exact same tailored wool jacket that had been damp against her shoulder when they walked through Washington Park. It was Thomas. A sudden wave of relief washed over her, followed immediately by a sharp, biting cold. He had told her he was buried in work. He had explicitly said he was stuck at the architecture firm all week, meeting a crucial deadline. Hillsborough was miles away from his office. She opened her mouth to call out his name, but the words died in her throat. Thomas was not alone. He was pushing a wheelchair. Lauren stepped backward, her boots squeaking softly against the polished linoleum. She instinctively ducked behind a towering display of organic pasta sauce, her heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps as she peered through the gaps between the glass jars. The woman in the wheelchair looked to be in her early 30s, perhaps even younger than Lauren. She had pale, porcelain skin and long blonde hair pulled back into a loose knot. She was undeniably beautiful, but it was a haunting, static kind of beauty. Her hands were folded awkwardly in her lap, her fingers curled inward like withered petals. But it was her eyes that stopped Lauren's heart. They were wide, blue, and completely vacant, staring straight ahead at a point in the air that simply did not exist. Thomas stopped the wheelchair near the produce section. He did not look hurried or anxious, like a man trapped in a dirty lie. He looked like a man who had done this exact routine 1,000 times before. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a soft white handkerchief, and knelt on the hard supermarket floor, completely oblivious to the other shoppers. With a tenderness so profound it made Lauren's stomach turn, he reached up and gently wiped a thin line of saliva from the woman's chin. "There we go, Elle," Thomas whispered. His voice carried down the quiet aisle, soft and heartbreakingly patient. "I know the lights in here are too bright for you. We will get your strawberries and go right back home, okay? I promise." He brushed a stray hair away from her forehead, his thumb lingering on her skin. The woman did not blink. She did not register his touch at all, but the devotion in his hazel eyes was unmistakable. It was the exact same look he gave Leo when they read together, the same look he gave Lauren across a candle-lit table. Lauren felt a cold, paralyzing terror seep deep into her bones. She pressed her back hard against the cool metal of the shelf, the jars rattling slightly behind her. This was not a secret mistress. This was an entire life she was never meant to see. Her mind raced, connecting the pieces with a sickening speed. The house under construction. The deadlines that kept him away. The invisible wall in the car. It was never about architecture. This silent, broken woman was the ghost haunting him. Thomas stood up and began to push the wheelchair toward the checkout counters. He moved with a practiced, heavy gait, the walk of a man who carried a mountain on his back every single day. Lauren stayed completely hidden, watching them until they disappeared through the automatic sliding doors. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand, stifling a quiet sob. She realized the devastating truth. She did not just love a man named Thomas. She loved a man who was drowning. He had used her and Leo to build a fantasy world, a desperate oasis where he wasn't just a full-time caretaker to a living shadow. She did not grab the cereal. Lauren turned and walked toward the back exit, her footsteps echoing hollowly in the quiet store. The caretaker's secret was out, and their beautiful dream was finally over. The air in Lauren's apartment felt dense, thick with the smell of cold coffee and damp rain. Under the dim yellow kitchen light, she sat perfectly still. On the table lay a crumpled Whole Foods receipt, small, forgettable, and devastating. The sound of a key turning in the lock made her flinch. The door opened. Thomas stepped in, shoulders slumped, hair damp from the storm. He dropped his keys onto the counter. The sharp metallic clatter echoed through the quiet. "Hey," he said, voice rough. He didn't look at her. "Is Leo asleep? I'm sorry I'm late. The office was a mess." Lauren didn't move. "He's been asleep for an hour, Thomas." Something in her tone made him stop. He turned slowly, his hazel eyes searching her face. He noticed the stillness, the rigid way she sat, the cold sharpness in her gaze. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly. Lauren reached out and flicked the receipt across the table. It slid to a stop in front of him. "You told me you were at the office," she said, her voice low but cutting. "Deadlines, meetings, blueprints." Thomas looked down at the receipt. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to. The color drained from his face. "I saw you," Lauren continued, her voice tightening. "In Hillsboro, in the produce aisle. I saw you wipe her mouth. I saw the way you leaned in, the way you spoke to her." Silence. "Who is she?" Lauren stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Is that the house you're always fixing? The one I'm never allowed to see? Have you been living a second life for 4 months? Thomas sank into the chair. He buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook not dramatically, but with something restrained, breaking. Her name is Elena, he said finally, his voice muffled. She's my wife. The word landed hard. Lauren gripped the counter, steadying herself. Your wife. 3 years ago, Thomas said, looking up, eyes red. We hit black ice driving back from the mountains. I walked away. She didn't, not really. Her body survived. Her mind didn't. He swallowed. She's like a child now, 6 years old maybe, trapped in a woman's body. She needs care all the time, every day. Lauren felt something shift inside her anger, colliding with something heavier. You lied, she said. Every single day. You used me, you used my son. I didn't cheat on you, Thomas said quickly, then faltered, as if the distinction didn't hold much weight anymore. His hand moved toward hers on the table, then stopped midway, retreating. I just wanted one night, he said, voice cracking. One night where I wasn't a caretaker, where I wasn't responsible for someone who doesn't even know who I am anymore. He stood and began pacing, restless, contained. I wanted to feel like a person again, he said. Not someone who measures medication, cleans feeding tubes, watches someone exist without being there. I wanted to be seen, not needed, not depended on, just seen. His voice dropped. I needed to believe there was still something ahead of me that wasn't just that room, that smell, that silence. Lauren watched him, tears finally slipping down her face. She thought of Leo, sitting at the table, carefully tracing letters while Thomas guided his hand. Patient, gentle, present. You built something here, she said quietly. With us. Thomas nodded once, sharply. I know. And Leo? Her voice trembled. Was he just part of it? Something to make you feel normal? No. Thomas looked at her, something urgent and raw in his expression. I love Leo. I love you. That's the only thing that felt real. Lauren inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She looked at him, really looked. The man who had helped her son find confidence. The man who had laughed in her kitchen. The man who had built something soft and safe. And the man who had done it on top of a lie. The trust wasn't cracked. It was gone. You can't have both, she said, her voice quieter now, but firm. You don't get to live in a version of life that feels better, and expect the people inside it not to get hurt when it collapses. Thomas stood still under the dim light, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. I know, he said. The rain pressed harder against the windows. Nothing in the room had changed, but whatever this was between them had. It wasn't broken in a sudden way. It had already been breaking, slowly, quietly. Now there was nothing left to pretend otherwise. The Willamette River was a ribbon of black glass under the pale, pre-dawn light. A biting wind whipped off the water, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold river mud. Lauren stood near the metal railing of the waterfront path. She pulled her coat tighter around her chest, shivering against the morning chill. Thomas stood a few feet away, his silhouette dark against the looming steel skeleton of the Hawthorne Bridge. The silence between them was immense, heavier than the fog rolling over the water. Thomas slowly reached into his inner coat pocket. His hands were visibly shaking. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, opening it carefully as if it contained something fragile. He slid out a small, creased photograph and held it out to her. Look at her, he said, his voice barely a rasp over the sound of the wind. Lauren hesitated, then stepped closer. She looked down at the picture. It was a candid shot of a laughing couple covered in white plaster dust. The man was a younger, much lighter version of Thomas. The woman leaning against him was Elena. But her eyes were not vacant and hollow like they had been at the supermarket. They were bright, fierce, and incredibly full of life. She was holding a rolled-up blueprint like a trophy. "We met in grad school," Thomas murmured, staring at the photo in Lauren's hand. "She was the smartest architect in our year. She designed buildings that made you want to stop and just stare. That picture was taken the day we finally opened our own firm." He gently took the photo back, running his thumb over Elena's smiling face. "It has been exactly 1,012 days since the accident," he continued. His tone was completely devoid of self-pity. It was just a hollow, exhausted statement of fact. 1,012 days of specialists, physical therapy, and feeding tubes. I sold my share of the firm to pay for her full-time care. I sold our house. I have given her every ounce of my time, my money, and my soul." Thomas looked up from the photo, meeting Lauren's eyes. The raw devastation in his gaze was terrifying. "I never abandoned her, Lauren. I never missed a single doctor's appointment. But the man in that picture," he pointed a trembling finger at the photograph, "he died in that car crash too. He has been dead for 3 years." Lauren swallowed hard, the cold air burning her throat. "So you used me to pretend he was still alive." "I used you as a painkiller," Thomas confessed, the brutal honesty tearing through the misty air. He took a step toward her, his voice breaking. "I know it was wrong. I know it was incredibly selfish. But my God, Lauren, I was drowning. Every single day was just a cycle of grief that never ended. And then I met you." A single tear slipped down his cold cheek. "You were the first person in 3 years who looked at me and didn't see a tragedy," he whispered. "You just saw me, being with you, reading books to Leo on the floor. It was the only time my chest didn't feel like it was being crushed. You were my escape hatch from a life I cannot survive." Lauren looked at the broken man standing in front of her. The burning anger that had fueled her through the night was slowly dying out, leaving nothing but a vast, empty expanse of sorrow. "You are not a monster, Thomas," Lauren said softly, the wind carrying her words away. "You are just a man who is incredibly tired, but I cannot be your painkiller, and my son cannot be your escape." Thomas closed his eyes, the absolute finality of her words washing over him. The pale sun finally began to break over the river, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the wreckage of their lives. The Beaverton Rehabilitation Clinic smelled sharply of rubbing alcohol and peppermint oil. The low, steady hum of physical therapy machines filled the warm afternoon air, but Lauren barely registered the noise. She stood perfectly still near the nurse's station, her shoulders aching fiercely from a long, grueling shift. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room. An elderly man named Arthur sat on a small stool beside a medical recliner, gently massaging the paralyzed, curled fingers of his wife. She had suffered a massive stroke 2 years ago. Lauren walked over slowly, keeping her voice soft and laced with professional empathy. "How is she doing today, Arthur?" Arthur did not stop his slow, rhythmic massaging. He looked up at Lauren with a frail smile, like a dying autumn leaf, but his eyes were completely hollow. "She is still breathing, Lauren," Arthur whispered. "For me, that is the only victory I have left." Lauren felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Looking past his quiet, unwavering devotion, she saw the heavy slump of his shoulders and the dark, bruised bags under his eyes. Arthur was not just a devoted husband. He was a willing prisoner, slowly fading away into his wife's tragedy. Lauren turned her head and looked through the glass partition toward the waiting area. Leo was sitting on a plastic chair, swinging his short legs as he patiently traced letters in a workbook. He was a little boy who needed the whole world. He needed a father who could be fully present, a man who could fight the monsters in his books. He did not need a man who only had half a soul left to give. She thought of Thomas, and the dark, silent room where Elena sat in her wheelchair. If she stayed with Thomas, what would she become? A substitute wife? A temporary nurse for his broken heart? She realized that if she walked into that house, She would eventually become just like Arthur, withering away, trying to keep a ghost from being forgotten. "I cannot do this to my son," Lauren whispered into the sterile air. Her compassion for Thomas was a vast, deep ocean, but she could not let her little boy drown in it. Love sometimes meant knowing when to walk away from a tragedy that was not yours. Thomas's pain was devastatingly real, but Leo's future was the only responsibility she could not betray. Lauren took a deep, shaky breath as a cold, heavy resolve settled into her chest. She finally knew exactly what she had to do. The old coffee shop sat nestled under the maple trees, their leaves beginning to drop like rusted coins onto the wet pavement. The wind chime above the door gave a sharp, dry clatter as Lauren stepped inside. Thomas was already there, sitting at the same wooden table where their fragile dream had first begun. Lauren sat down, but she didn't offer the warm smile he was looking for. She placed a small paper bag on the table. Inside was the architectural picture book Thomas had given to Leo, the one about great cathedrals and bridges. Thomas looked at the bag, then up at her, his hazel eyes rimmed with red. "Are you returning the memories too?" Lauren laced her fingers together tightly to keep them from shaking. "Memories are what we carry in our hearts, Thomas. But this book, it belongs to a world that my son and I cannot enter." There was no shouting. There were no bitter accusations. There was only the sound of ragged breathing and the quiet tracks of tears rolling down Lauren's cheeks. She looked at the man she had truly wanted to build a home with, and she felt a soul-crushing ache. But that pain wasn't hatred. It was a cruel, necessary compassion. "You are a good man, Thomas," Lauren said, her voice trembling but firm with a cold resolve. "But I cannot love a man who only brings half a soul to the table, while the other half belongs to a grave that hasn't been buried yet." Thomas bowed his head, his shoulders shaking violently. His silence was a devastating confession. He knew she was right. "Elena needs you," Lauren continued, reaching out to touch the back of his hand one last time. "She needs that absolute devotion just to survive. And Leo, he needs a hero of his own, a hero who can look into his eyes without seeing the shadow of another woman." Lauren stood up. She didn't look back as she walked toward the door. The cold Portland wind rushed in as the door opened, but for the first time in days, her chest felt light. She felt like she could finally breathe again. Thomas remained at the table, alone with a cold cup of coffee and a book of buildings he would never get to show her. He stayed behind with his responsibility, his broken love, and his ghost. Lauren stepped out into the rain, gripped Leo's hand tightly as he waited in the car, and began the long drive toward a lonely but peaceful new chapter. It was a story without a miracle, but in the wreckage, she had finally found her truth. Thank you for listening to this episode of Soul-Stirring Stories. Life isn't always about perfect endings. Sometimes it's about the courage to face a heartbreaking truth and the strength to choose the right path, even when it hurts. If Thomas and Lauren's journey touched your heart, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Lauren's shoes? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to join our community. Stay tuned for more raw, human stories that stay with you long after they end.